Before we actually talk about SMEs, etc., I just wanted to highlight the sort of history of Reliance Commercial Finance in primarily dealing with the SMEs. Now, we started business sometime in 2007, and we realized that while the SME as a sector was contributing so much to the Indian economy, the attention that the bankers or the financing institutions were giving to this sector was definitely less than what was desired. And so much so that, the RBI statistics actually tell you the story that hardly about 7 to 8% of the MSMEs in the country are financially included. The rest of them do not have any formal means of financing. So we realized that this is not only a great business opportunity for us, but it is also a way for us to actually do something which is relevant from a societal perspective. So we launched this business in 2007, primarily focused upon the SME sector. And in the past 7, 8 odd years, we would have interacted with over about 200,000 such SMEs, self-employed SMEs, all put together of various shapes and sizes, and disbursed more than about 40,000 crores to this particular sector. And even today, more than 90% of our customer base are primarily the SME or the self-employed kind of a segment. Now, while we have been doing business, what we also acquired, which is I think very significant, is certain amount of knowledge about how this entire sector operates. And if I were to summarize that experience that we have gained over the past 6, 7 years for the benefit of the audience, I'll put the entire phase of life of an SME into 4 parts. One is the startup stage, which is primarily a lot of enthusiasm of the entrepreneur, etc., which comes in, new ideas, fresh thinking. Then there is a certain amount of consolidation or scaling up phase, when the need for enthusiasm goes down, but the need to be more process oriented actually comes in. The third phase is that after you reach a particular plateau, you need to start gearing up for the next hype. So which means that you need to rejuvenate the organization. And the fourth one, which is in certain cases becomes an unfortunate eventuality, is an exit or a death of the organization itself. Primarily we have seen, there are statistics to show you that about 50% of the MSMEs which start off die in a period of about 3 years' time. So the mortality rate is pretty high. And when you actually look at the reasons for that, there are quite a few learnings that we have. Let me start with the first phase of the inception and then take one after the other. Now, when the business really kicks off, now obviously the person starts from a zero base, and therefore he has very little to lose and everything to gain. So therefore the discomfort or the sort of fear of failure is a little muted at that time, and he tends to get a lot of benefit and a lot of support from his family members and very close friends and so on and so forth. He sets up a particular business with a certain amount of idea, makes a certain amount of mark. Now, there are 2 key factors which are really involved. How far is he thinking in terms of what is his vision in terms of his business? Is he going to have a very small sort of a goal that, okay, I will be a very small guy and just make my ends meet? Or is he really wanting to become a big industrialist? So therefore, if he wants to become a big industrialist, he has to think a little longer. So his entire marketing strategy, his entire product orientation, his entire thought process has to be oriented towards a long-term vision and a goal. Now, if that clicks and he gets the right kind of support, the industrialist actually takes very, very strong foundation for a leap forward. But if the same person were to have a very short-term view, saying that, okay, I'm going to be a fly-by-night operator, I'm going to make a quick buck and exit, he tends to actually have a very short-lived existence, and therefore the high mortality in that stage is very critical. Now, as a funding organization, any bank or an NBFC of our type would certainly look for So what is the sort of mental orientation the entrepreneur has? When he comes across, we ask him a lot of questions to find out what is his mental makeup. Is he likely to be another Dhirubhai Ambani, or is he likely to be another person who just came and went? And what is he really going to do with our money, right? Is he going to put it in the right place, in the right purpose, or is it just going to be diverted and put into land or a share market or whatever it is, or any other speculative purpose for which it was not originally intended? So this is very critical for us to understand the mental makeup. Now that sets the key foundation for the growth and prosperity of the business. Now if that is not right, the entire thing will collapse. Fine. So he's done a certain amount of work, he's grown to a particular level, he's primarily exhausted the resources that his family and friends were able to give. So he has to now go and raise some debt. So he comes to banks or institutions like us and takes some amount of money, grows further. Then comes the second phase of a scale up. Now when you really want to scale up, there are 2-3 issues which are involved. One is the business model is more or less tested out, you have done your experiments, you have done whatever mistakes that you needed to do. Now the room or the appetite for making mistakes actually goes down. People expect you to be a lot more stable, people expect you to be a little more customer oriented, a little more process oriented, a little more long term in your viewpoint. So there is a certain amount of scaling up and a stabilization phase that comes in. Here we find that most of the SMEs actually failed because primarily their only asset that they have had is the enthusiasm or the enterprise of the promoter. Now when that has to give way to process orientation, people tend to make a mistake in the changeover. And so therefore they do not keep their accounts properly, they do not pay their taxes, they don't maintain the difference between personal cash and business cash, and therefore the entire thing gets muddled up. So and when they want to get money, either from a bank or an NBFC or even for raising external capital, if they want to approach a venture capital fund or whatever, the first thing any of us will look at is he really having a good level of corporate governance? Now corporate governance does not mean having a wonderful board with a lot of illustrious people on your board, but primarily it's a way you think and whether you're able to understand the difference between the personal money and the business money. So that's one key factor. And how really process oriented, is he really built up the necessary systems of processes? Does he have the right kind of manpower? Has he put in, is he part of the right institutions and the associations or not? What is he really doing with regard to skill development of his people? These become very critical for him to scale up into the next level, and these are exactly the questions any venture capitalist or a bank or an NBFC will ask. If those questions are good, then assistance will be forthcoming. He can actually scale up and go to a much greater level and need not necessarily only be an MSME. Then assume that okay, he's crossed this particular phase, he's done very well. The business model tends to plateau over a period of time, and as Ashish rightly mentioned, the business cycles or the product life cycle of any idea today is getting smaller and smaller. It is no longer a 20-30 year kind of idea, it is only a 3-year, 4-year kind of thing. So you need to rejuvenate or reinvent your organization again. And for that, the entrepreneur certainly must be very closely be in touch with what is really happening in the ecosystem, keep on refurbishing his own knowledge of the industry, looking for new opportunities, getting a networking done properly, and maybe even going back to school once in a while, and ensuring that his mind is kept open. Only then can he actually junk an idea which has become plateaued and move on to something which is really good. And that is very, very critical for us to do. Even very, very large corporations have failed to make that cut, and let me give an example of Kodak, for instance. Kodak used to be the market leader in the camera and film equipment, and they failed to see the digital revolution coming across, and they still persisted with their film-backed film production and the film-backed cameras. Today Kodak is nothing, right? Because they failed to see the change coming across and therefore failed to scale up and failed to move on onto a new idea. And this is a mistake which most of the SMEs tend to make, of not being able to junk their existing model and move on to something, because they tend to focus too much inward and fail to absorb what is really happening from the outside. So building a good ecosystem which will keep his own knowledge stronger and keeping on reinventing oneself is very, very critical for him to go to the third stage and again grow from there. Now, if all of this fails and at some stage or the other, the entrepreneur has to decide that, look, it's a bad idea, let me exit. because it might make sense. And in the stock market, if you are familiar with it, there is always a stop loss which is there. If you fail to put a stop loss, you will be reduced to nothing. So even in business, there is a need for us to define what is a stop loss. And if that stop loss point is getting closer, it is necessary to exit the business, either sell to somebody who can run it better, or maybe even wind down and close the shop, move on to something else, learn from this bad experience and try to create something different and enrich yourselves. Now, in this particular thing, what is really critical is therefore, again, when you start winding down, the biggest question or the stumbling block that you will face is from the regulators. That have you paid your PF on time? Have you kept your tax records on time? Is your assessments completed on time? Have you, complied with the local environmental laws or labor laws and so on? So these are very critical even to wind down. So again, the question of governance actually comes in. Okay, so if you don't do all that, there is no question of even being allowed to shut down, because there will be a host of legal cases behind you, etc., etc. So life will become very difficult. So the whole theme behind this whole journey of an SME, from inception till growth to plateauing to rejuvenation to even to death, you really have to ensure that you think in the right manner. I think the whole process of being able to think right and act right is very critical, and therefore there is a need for the entrepreneur to keep on understanding what is really happening in the world, how to really scale up, how to really bring in the right kind of practices, learn from others' mistakes, and keep on going. It's not just a question of just having a product and being able to sell it. I think it's a lot more. The biggest thing really starts from the thought process in itself. If that is right, help shall be forthcoming from venture capitalists, from banks, from institutions like ours, and also from regulators, because everybody will see you as a good citizen, and that's that's a seed for building a great business, which is probably small today, but can become a world beater tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Srinivasan. I think the point that you mentioned or you really emphasized on is also something which Mr. Chauhan also has mentioned. He has brought it in the form of a listing, but the moot point remains here is ensuring a good governance and compliance, and that's to be the good citizen in the corporate industry. And sometimes what happens is that, which you very rightly given an example, that my own money and the company's money get mixed up. So these sometimes happens because of some lack of attention to the governance side, or sometimes because of lack of knowledge or awareness also. And
I think a lot has got to do with the lack of awareness, which is true. It's not that people generally do this intentionally, but most of the time it is through mistake. So therefore it is better to be forewarned and better to be knowledgeable about what is really the implication of what you're doing, rather than getting into a situation and getting into a jam.
Yes, true.
I would not say that people do it for nefarious reasons,
Indeed.
but primarily it is through mistakes.
Indeed, but also in the eyes of the law, whether it was intentional or unintentional, that doesn't make any difference. So that's very important point which you mentioned. The other one which you mentioned is the continuous increase of the knowledge to the better networking, of getting to know people, getting to know what's happening in his industry, and how does he retire his products or services at the right time and goes for the newer things, which again of course relates back to his affordability and investment, whether he has. But beyond the governance, beyond the knowledge, of course the fundamental thing of course in any business stands out to be the customer. So whatever he does to improve the health of his performance, but the one thing one shouldn't forget, be it an MSME or be it a large sector, is that the customer is the king. That who am I working for, who am I producing for, how do I reach out to them, and how do I make them happy, and continuously work out on models, then how do I really make my customers happy. I mean, of course, that at no cost of governance being compromised, but if I am actually working for my customer, then the knowledge part automatically will have to come in, because otherwise then I'm not serving my customers well.
And when we say good corporate citizen, it actually means having the customer's interest primarily in your heart. and working towards that, because that builds relationships. I don't think today it is very easy to acquire a new customer, but whatever customers that you have acquired, it is critical to hold on to them. And people will only stick to you if they believe that you can add value to them in the long run. And you are not a transaction-oriented guy, but more a relationship-oriented person. That is very critical. Governance actually starts with this whole thing. I completely agree with you. And also, of course, there is a lot of ecosystem that is today developing in terms of industry associations providing a marketing, marketplace and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the entrepreneur has to be qualified enough to make use of these facilities that are coming across. Otherwise, the whole thing kind of falls flat.